Hello everyone and welcome. We are so glad to have you join us today for our webinar on Is Your Company's Data Secure? I'm Kathy Vasquez with Max Technical Training and I'm going to be your moderator today. We have a few more webinars that are find them of interest. On the 21st, we have a webinar that's specifically for business analysts or those who would like to be, and that one is about how business analysts provide value in today's work environment. On the 23rd, for those of you who use SharePoint or are SharePoint administrators, the webinar SharePoint 2013 Search Secrets will provide valuable and useful time-saving tips for you. On the 29th, for anyone who has led a project or will be leading a project, we have a webinar called Managing a Project with Your Team. There will be a link to all of these webinars in an email that you will receive tomorrow. In that email, you will also receive a link to the recording of this particular webinar as well as the slide deck. So if you're interested in those, you'll be able to link to them to register tomorrow. Now I have to give you my 30-second commercial for Max Technical Training because today's Lunch and Learn is brought to you by Max. Max is a premier provider of software and professional skills education for IT and business professionals, delivering training in top technologies and methodologies for over 17 years. Clients prefer Max because our trainers are highly qualified experts in their subject areas. They help clients solve real problems as part of the typical classroom experience. Instruction at Max is not one size fits all. We develop and deliver modified and customized curriculum that delivers training both privately or publicly. We can provide it on your site or here at our campus. We also provide follow-up mentoring, coaching, and consulting for those clients who need that extra boost to transform training into action. And my commercial's over. Thank you for your patience listening to that. We're just about ready to start, so I just have a couple of housekeeping tips that I want to share with all of our attendees. Shelley has agreed to take questions throughout her presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question bar in your GoToMeeting console. We will voice those questions for you. If for some reason we're not able to get your question in during her presentation, we will ensure that she answers that at the end. If you do have an issue or you have any comments, please use the chat section. Brandon is our technical lead today, and if you have any issues with sound or any technical issues, please type those into the chat section and he will help you work that out. A reminder that we are recording today's session, and an email with a link to that as well as the slide deck will be coming to you tomorrow. And so now I'm pleased to introduce you to Shelley Vinson. Shelley is a Microsoft certified trainer and consultant specializing in SQL Server and SharePoint technologies. She has worked as a SQL Server administrator and developer on multiple projects, including writing stored procedures and functions, setting up security, and writing and scheduling maintenance tasks. Shelley has worked with multiple government and healthcare agencies on SharePoint planning and infrastructure projects, including implementing managed metadata services, user profile services, and SharePoint search, and incorporating HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley requirements and auditing. Shelley is also the founder and the director of a nonprofit outreach program in New York City called Project Light NYC Inc. Welcome, Shelley, and thank you for your time today. And I leave it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kathy. I'm very excited to be here today and talking about something I'm actually very passionate about, which is your company's data secure? So I want to start today's webinar with a couple of polling questions. So the first polling question, and I'd love for everybody to participate with this, the first question is, what is your #1 reason for attending this webinar? So Kathy, I'll hand it over to you there.
All right, everybody, please give your votes. We've got people voting. Wonderful. We've got 20% voting. I'll leave this poll open for about another 20 seconds. Got good participation. We're at 50% voting. 10 more seconds. 75% have voted. All right, I'll be closing the poll in a couple of seconds. Let's see if we can get 100%. So we have, I'm closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. We had 90% voted, and the results are in order of preference. So the question is, what is your number one reason for attending this webinar? And Shelley, 58% voted, I want to know what I can do to secure my company's data. The next highest were 27% said, I want to hear why all these high-profile data breaches are, what they're about. And then 15%, we are starting to implement security best practices.
Okay, so yeah, coming from a data, as a database administrator myself, I hear about all these crazy data hacks and all these data breaches that are going on, and I'm going, why is this happening? What's going on here? Also, I was very interested moving to the cloud and having all of these cloud options available for our data, and a lot of people are hesitant about moving to the cloud. So I also was very interested in figuring out, you know, is the cloud one of the reasons for these data breaches? So this is great. I'm glad that people are here to learn how to secure your data, because obviously this is happening over and over and over. And I'm going to go into an anatomy of several of these high-profile data hacks and talk to you about some of the main reasons that they are happening, and you'll probably be surprised at actually what the number one and number two culprits are for some of these, for a lot of these high-profile data hacks. And we definitely will cover security best practices as well, so that for those of you that are going to be implementing security or are responsible for that at your job, I will give you some tips and tricks to help you so that your company will be much more protected and less likely to be a victim of one of these cyber attacks. Let's go on to the next polling question. And the next question is, how many high-profile data breaches can you think of off the top of your head that have happened in the last year? So, Kathy, go ahead and take it away on that one.
All right. I think they can see it and read it, so we've got some good participation. Much quicker, everyone. I like to see that. We already have 50% have voted. And we have 70% voting. Maybe we'll make it to 100% before we close the poll this time. 94%. At 30 seconds with the poll open. Looks like that's what we're going to get. So we have 94%. I'm closing the poll. 3, 2, 1. And the results are, Shelley, 52% of the people voted 5 to 10. 31% can remember more than 10 high-profile data breaches, and 17% say they recall less than 5. I will hide this poll.
Okay. Yeah, so most of you are thinking between 5 and 10 high-profile data breaches that you can think of right off the top of your head. And if you actually look at the statistics for how many data breaches have happened, especially in the last 2 years, it is crazy. And I mean, these are huge companies that are getting cyber attacked, and it's not always just for the monetary value as well. It's also for our personal information that's out there. I'm a very, very big advocate of privacy, and just the fact to know that, hey, my social security number could be out there, or hey, my email address or my phone number or my cell phone could be out there. All of those can be issues that we're going to be talking about in this webinar. So what we're going to cover in this particular webinar today is talk specifically about the Target data breach, because I know I love Target. I love shopping at Target, and when I found out that there was a Target breach, and a lot of people have these Target Red cards that are hooked to their checking account and things like that, it just really makes people nervous, and they want to know what happened. So we're going to talk about that, and you're probably going to be, if you haven't read a whole lot about it, you might be very surprised to hear what actually some of the reasons why that Target breach actually happened. We'll also talk about the cost. We'll talk about you know, just some of the repercussions that came out of that. And then I also want to talk about the Anthem data breach, because I know I was one of those people that received a letter from Anthem saying, hey, your data is probably being compromised. What are some things that you need to do about that? So we'll talk about the Anthem data breach, look at a brief case study on that. And then I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about Edward Snowden, because even though that was it wasn't necessarily a cyber attack, it definitely exposed a lot of, information, whether you're on the one side of him where you think, yes, the NSA should not be collecting that data, I'm glad that he told, or maybe you're on the other side of things where you're saying he's a criminal and he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. What I wanted to do is really look at what happened with Edward Snowden and talk about how your employees, you really do have to be careful about checks and balances that are in there, and I think you'll be surprised to hear some of the things that actually went down at the NSA regarding Edward Snowden. Some of it's hearsay, so I would say I've done as much research as I can, and it'll just be interesting to see what all came out of that. So we're going to talk about what these data breaches have in common. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're seeing sticks out in each of these case studies as well. We're going to talk about some top issues that are found in data breaches. I'm also going to talk about the monetary cost of these data breaches, and sometimes it's hard to actually put a numeric value on those data breaches, but we'll try the best that we can there, and then talk about some ways that you can protect your data. And it's actually very interesting because most of the things that we're going to talk about are not going to be, oh wow, I've never heard of that, or oh wow, I did not realize that was something I was supposed to do. These things are going to be very common in a governance document, but it's a matter of knowing it versus actually implementing it. And so I want to talk about how to protect your data, and I've got some good websites I want to share with you as well. So let's go ahead and first of all get into the target data breach. The attack basically started on November 27th of 2013. Well, think about what's going on around November 27th, right? That's around Thanksgiving. What's the day after Thanksgiving? Of course, that's Black Friday, and this is when the target data breach started happening. And basically what happened was Target personnel discovered that data breach, but they didn't actually notify the Justice Department until December 13th. I'm sure they had things going on and they were trying to, do their best that they could to stop this from actually happening. But as of December 15th of 2013, Target actually had a third-party forensic team in place, and they had mitigated the attack at that point. So the attack started on November 27th, Black Friday, but the story itself actually did not come out to the public until December 18th. So basically they were trying to fight off this attack for several weeks, and ultimately more than 70 million customers had their information stolen. So some of it was credit card information, some of it was email addresses, there were names, there were phone numbers that were stolen, and basically these hackers were able to get all of this customer data. Now what's very interesting is that all of the basically all of the people who made debit or credit card purchases, which was about 110 million shoppers that made purchases during that time, their information was taken. So 70 million customers. Some of those customers obviously were had gone in there multiple times by the time that this actually happened. So the attackers, going on to my next slide, the attackers essentially stole about 11 gigs of data is what they were able to get. And essentially, if you look to what really went down, the hackers were able to break into essentially into the POS system by using login credentials that they were able to get from the heating and air conditioning system. So you're looking at that correctly, in that was actually someone coming in from the people who were going in and dealing with the heating and the air conditioning. So what I tell my customers is, you can't just look at your own data, right? You have to look at all of those vendors that are actually having access to your data as well. And I believe it's unsubstantiated, but I have heard and read from multiple sources that the password that they were able to get to inside that HVAC unit was 1234. And if you think about just like the most basic password in the world, 1234 would probably be one of the first things that you would try, right? So ultimately the hackers were able to get into the HVAC system, and ultimately they were able to figure out how to get sysadmin rights and then be able to get into, just with basically bombarding the network there, they were able to get a sysadmin login into Target, and then they were eventually able to upload this Citadel malware onto that POS system. So the Citadel malware is actually a variant of the Zeus baking Trojan. You know, you think about those Trojan horses, you hear about that, you have to be aware of that. And essentially they were able to download that baking Trojan onto the POS system, and one thing led to another. They were able to go in, get those login credentials. So what else is interesting about the Citadel malware and the Zeus banking Trojan is that pretty much all the malware detectors that are out there are able to detect that Citadel malware that's out there, but the problem was that the HVAC system was actually using the free version of Malwarebytes, anti-malware, and that actually didn't have the real-time protection because of the fact that it was an on-demand scanner. It wasn't necessarily watching out for what was going on behind the scenes with that. So essentially they had, you know, they could say, hey, we have software out there that's protecting us, but the version of the anti-malware that they had out there wasn't actually going to be able to detect that. If they had had the full version of Malwarebytes, it probably would have caught it. They probably wouldn't have been able to get on there. If they had had much more secure passwords for being able to get into that HVAC system, this whole thing could have, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say it would have been prevented, but those are things that are simple things. And so like I was saying before, when you look at ways that you want to protect your data, it's not necessarily things that you've never heard of. You know, everybody knows, oh, you're supposed to have antivirus software running out there, right? Everyone knows, oh, you're supposed to have a strong password out there. And in the end, those were two of the things that were big culprits into allowing those hackers to be able to break in to Target. So if you look at the third bullet point on my slide that I have here, you know, you think about third parties accessing your network. That happens all the time. I mean, I work with SharePoint, and we'll have, let's say, board members that are, you know, don't work for the company, so they're not getting into maybe our internal SharePoint system, but they're able to get into yet another portion of SharePoint that's got different kind of authentication out there. And you've got to make sure, if you're going to allow those third parties to be able to access your network, you've got to make sure that you've got the security so that they're not able to find those back doors and to be able to get into your systems. I remember a long time ago, I was actually on a ski trip out in Colorado, and it was when the SQL worm virus hit. This was probably like around 2003, 2004, and what had happened was all the SQL servers out there that had SA and a blank password got hit. You know, and so we know 12 years later, we know not to use SA with a blank password, right? We know we need to have secure passwords, but if you take a look at what was actually happening with Target, those things basically mandating two-factor authentication for having your contractors who have access to sensitive information, also having some kind of antivirus that can actually detect that, because Malwarebytes, anti-malware, that's highly regarded by experts. So it's not that the Malwarebytes, anti-malware didn't work. It's just that they were using the free version. They weren't using the actual paid-for version, and it was more of an on-demand kind of thing versus something that it's watching for all the time. So basically, essentially what they were able to do is get in through that HVAC system. They were able to figure out which portal they were having to subvert, and then basically use that as a staging point to get into Target's internal network. So Target has never officially said, as far as I know, what their entry point was, but pretty much I think everybody can agree that the HVAC system was the culprit there. And again, it was just a vendor that they were thinking, oh, they just need to get access to the HVAC system, and then who knows, now 70 million people had their credit cards and names and phone numbers stolen. Okay, so going back here, you can see the cost to Target was actually $252 million. So that is a huge cost to Target. Plus, you know, just the fact that everybody who shops at Target is now like, okay, are you guys going to secure your data? And you feel so helpless that you want to shop there, but you feel like, is, you know, my data going to be secure from this point on? So if you take a look at their basic cybersecurity fails, the fact that they had some weak passwords, not even necessarily in Target internally, but in their vendor applications, and also a failure to segment their networks and be able to make sure that those vendors were not able to actually access other parts of their system, and not just the HVAC system. Okay, so that's the first case study I wanted to look at. Like I said, or like Kathy had mentioned earlier, if anybody does have a question, feel free to write it down there in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to answer those questions. Let's go ahead and let's talk about the Anthem data breach. Now, this one is very interesting. This one actually happened this year in January 29th of 2015. Now, this one did not involve credit cards, but it did involve current and former customers and employees. Actually, even employees had their information stolen from Blue Cross Blue Shield. So 80 million current and former customers were affected by this. So names, social security numbers. Think about what a hacker can do with a name, a social security number, a birthday, right? I mean, they're going to be able to go out there and actually, you know, apply for credit cards, apply for credit, get things in your name that are actually not for you. I read somewhere that even employee salary information was actually obtained by this data breach that was out there. So all of the Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, all of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Georgia, Empire Blue Cross Blue Shield. You know, you think about Blue Cross Blue Shield, you would think that they would have, you would just, I don't know that you would necessarily think that would be someone that, you know, hackers would target, but they were actually able to get in and be able to get that. So if we look at some issues that came up from the Anthem data breach, if you read articles about what happened with Anthem, first of all, their sensitive data wasn't encrypted. And if you look at what some people said the reason was, well, first of all, HIPAA, which is obviously the governing body for anything that's healthcare related, HIPAA actually doesn't require encryption because you might have heard Microsoft, if you've ever been in a Microsoft event, they'll talk about defense in depth. And so what you want to do there when you think about you know, making sure that hackers aren't able to get into your data is you don't just want to have one level of security, right? Think about, for example, if you get into, let's say, a SQL Server database, you don't normally just get into the server and then voila, you're sysadmin, you have access to everything, right? Normally you have to log into your Windows authentication. If you're using Active Directory, you have to go into that gate. Then you have to log into SQL Server, and you have to have permissions just to log into the server. And from that point on, you have permission. Just because you can log onto the server doesn't mean that you can necessarily get into all the databases on that server or even all of the tables and columns inside there. So you might have permission to a server and then to a single database, but not all the databases. So the idea really is we need to have that defense in depth so that we have multiple levels of security between whoever's logging in and the actual data behind the scenes. So the fact that HIPAA doesn't require encryption, you know, I think maybe does surprise certain people, but they definitely strongly encourage it. And basically, if you look at what Anthem said, they were like, in terms of why they didn't encrypt their data, a lot of it was because it was inconvenient. Well, you have to really think about, okay, is this the data that I'm looking at, the data that I'm holding, what would happen if people were to be able or were to get access to that data? in this case, would it have been much more convenient for them later on to look at that and go, wow, if the hackers have gotten to the data but they weren't able to decrypt it, it wouldn't have been too good for them, right? Or it wouldn't have actually worked out well for them. So you do really want to think about, as part of your governance document, you have to know your data. You have to know what kind of data you have out there. And just because you have one or two security systems in place, what if people were able to get through to that? What would happen if they were able to get credit card numbers or social security numbers or things like that? So, you know, the fact that their data wasn't encrypted, again, you'll find articles on there that will say, it still could have happened, but it would have been one more piece of that defense in depth to keep people from, you know, having everyone's social security numbers and employment information compromised. So what's interesting about the Anthem data breach, if you look at the next to last bullet point on the slide, the attackers, oh, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have a question. So
yes.
So before you move on, the question is, can you describe what's involved with segmenting a network? How does it limit the damage done by hackers once they gain access to a network?
Okay, that's a great question. So let's say, for example, let's go back to what we were talking about with the target data breach. So let's say for like the HVAC system versus, let's say, the internal network. Basically, what should have happened is that the segment of the network that the people that were coming in from HVAC, they should have been able to get onto that part of the network, and they should never have had any access to any other parts of that network that were out there. And you'd have to talk to your network administrator about this. And I always joke about this in class because I come from, you know, the data environment, and I always say you got to be friends with your network admins, and you got to be friends with your developers, because everybody has to work together. You can't just have it to be where, oh, the data is secure, we're good to go. Everybody's been in those meetings where everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else, right? Well, it wasn't the SQL Server issue. It was definitely a network issue. But going back to the segmenting of the network, you've got to talk to your network admins and make sure that there are no holes, so that when one segment of your network is open, maybe they can get into that to do what they need to do there from a vendor standpoint. But what happened in the target breach is one of the accounts that was actually in that segmented part of their network did actually have access to other parts of the network, and that's what the hackers were able to basically find out and then be able to get into other parts of the network. If the network had been segmented correctly, they would have been able to get in and do their job from an HVAC standpoint, but they would not have been able to get into other parts of the network, for example, the POS system. And again, you have to have that defense in depth in place, and you also have to have those, you know, your antivirus running, so that if other things do get compromised, let's say, for example, that in the case of Target, they were able to get onto the network, if they had had that Malwarebytes running or something that had detected that, that Trojan horse, it could have caught it there, even though they had an issue with their network. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit more. Again, I don't consider myself a network administrator, so that's why I always bring in a network admin to help me on any projects that I'm on, and make sure that every piece of the puzzle is completely secure, so that we're not going to have those issues with that defense in depth breaking down. Great question. Anybody else?
I don't have any other questions right now.
Okay, so let's keep going on to the fourth bullet point on the slide here. Notice that part of the reason that the data breach happened at Anthem is that the attackers were able to get to at least 5 sets of employee credentials. Now, what's interesting about this is something that you'll find out happens over and over and over, and I think this surprises a lot of people, that employee credentials get compromised. Others of you that are network admins will be like, I know that happens all the time. People give me their username and password, and you know, the password just isn't secure enough, or if they're going around talking about their password. We used to even joke about the lion, which we would call people who had their screens with all their usernames and passwords back in the day when you would have multiple usernames and passwords for different systems. Write it on a sticky note and stick it on your monitor. Not too secure, right? Or take your username and password, stick it under your keyboard. That's real secure. Nobody would ever think to look there, right? But ultimately, this data breach was partially caused by the fact that employee credentials were compromised, and it could have been literally that someone thought, hey, this person works for the company, I'm supposed to give him my credentials. So that comes down to employee training and realizing that people should never be giving their username and password to other employees. If I'm a sysadmin, I don't need someone's username and password to be able to go in and get my job done. I can have them test it out. I don't need to have that information. So the fact that at least 5 sets of employee credentials were compromised, one of those could have had higher security credentials, and then they can get in from that. So essentially what they did was they figured out which sets of employee credentials were going to give them the access they need. Then they went in, they used a phishing scam to distribute malware. And again, it goes back to having that antivirus software out there running to be able to catch that. And had they had that running, they would have been able to maybe stop the attack on harvesting those employee credentials. So once they were able to get the employee credentials that they needed, then it was just a matter of time before they could log in with someone who had very high permissions, and then they were able to get in there and basically get into the data. So with the Anthem data breach and the Target data breach, you can start to see a couple of things that are things that you would want to watch out for that you might be surprised about. And notice I haven't yet talked once about the data was in the cloud and the data was hacked in the cloud. So just keep that in mind as we go along. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Edward Snowden and the NSA, because when this story first broke, I was very interested in this. I was like, what the heck, first of all, is the NSA doing with my data? I'm not a criminal. Why are they looking at this? And second of all, what kind of information are they looking at? And third, how did this Edward Snowden guy, how did he get all this information? Because Edward Snowden actually is a former CIA employee, and he was a contractor for the NSA. So this is something else that you have to really watch out for, the fact that he actually didn't even work for the NSA on a full-time basis. He was a contractor for the NSA, and ultimately he around May and June of, I believe he left the NSA in May of 2013, but it actually really didn't come out in terms of all the information that he had gathered until in early June of 2013. So I guess now he's wanting to come back to the U.S. and, be tried for his crimes or whatever. But essentially that was the timeline for what happened with Edward Snowden. He stole over 1 million documents. Not even the NSA actually knows how many documents that were out there. I have heard from unsubstantiated sources that he actually got access to a SharePoint content database and was able to hack into that. But this is the thing that I want to point out. Look at that next to last bullet point on the slide. He may have convinced 25, I've actually heard even higher numbers. I've heard 25 to 27, even 28, possibly up to 28 people at the NSA gave him their usernames and passwords. So you look at that, I mean, that just seems crazy that he was able to get that, but you could also imagine people that haven't been trained to know that we as sysadmins do not need usernames and passwords to be able to do our job. If he's able to get all those usernames and passwords, who knows what kind of information he's able to get off of that. And then ultimately, these files were pulled off of a file sharing sector of the internet. So again, I heard it was a SharePoint content database, but I heard that from a person. I've never been able to substantiate that on the internet, so I'm not sure. But even if that was the case, it would have been the situation where he probably didn't have the authentication to get into it, or even if he had, maybe one of those 25 staffers also had that extra information that was out there. So if we look at basically what he did, this is a smart guy. Okay, and Venati, they're a security firm, and they did a full case study about Edward Snowden and the NSA and how he was able to get this. But essentially, he was able to fabricate some SSH keys. And SSH, that's a cryptographic protocol for being able to use cryptography over remote access, and it is something that's used on a regular basis by sysadmins. And basically, he was able to fabricate some SSH keys. He was able to have some create his own signed digital certificates that were out there, and then he was able to access and steal those documents. So, you know, if you think about what we were talking about with Anthem, where Anthem's data wasn't encrypted, well, even if it had been encrypted, like I said, that wouldn't necessarily have 100% secured him, because if you look here at Edward Snowden, he still was able to fabricate some of his SSH keys, but at the same time, what was going on with the other people that were on his team? Could they have figured some of this out in terms of these fabricated keys and these digital certificates that were out there? So I think a lot of what you look at with Edward Snowden, first of all, he started being bothered by, you know, the documentation that he figured out the NSA was holding out there, but the fact that he wasn't actually an employee, that he was a contractor, that he had very high security clearance, and the fact that he had all these people at the NSA giving him this information, that's really where he basically went rogue and decided to go in and steal all those documents. But a lot of it was because of the fact that he had those usernames and passwords out there, and he was able to get to that information. So even, you know, if there had been some auditing in place, if there had been, you know, some checks and balances in place, who knows what could have been stopped from this, and that maybe this could have been handled in a different manner instead of him going out to WikiLeaks or whatever and, you know, putting all these classified documents out there for the internet for anybody to be able to see. And we've even seen, you know, like a lot of those emails that were coming from like the State Department, that a lot of that came from the NSA as well. So yeah, so let's go, if we take a look at just some other high-profile data breaches. Staples. Okay, so back in October of 2014, hackers were able to get over 1.16 million credit cards. JP Morgan Chase, personal information of 83 million people was stolen. They were actually not able to get to the credit card numbers, I believe, there, but personal information was compromised, which again can cause people to be able to go in and, you know, open up credit cards, take out loans and things like that in other people's names. Sony, we all remember that one, right? That was actually the FBI thinks it was North Korean government that went out there, exposed all those emails. A lot of people lost their jobs over that. It was embarrassment to the Sony company. Ashley Madison, you've heard about that one. That one was probably an inside job. I think they're not exactly sure at this point what happened there, but you can imagine, you know, anybody who's signed up for that website, first of all, I think that's a good lesson to all of us, that we cannot, you know, something like that, you just can't be surprised when you thought your data was secure and boom, it's not. But at the same time, I know it ruined a lot of lives. In their case, I heard about 4 or 5 suicides that happened off of that. And then Patreon, this is one that happened very recently. Patreon is actually a nonprofit, I believe, and what they were able to get there, it's a subscription system for like users to donate. So like you can donate to artists, musicians. It may not be a nonprofit, but it's, you know, it's basically out there helping artists, helping musicians, helping journalists. And basically hackers were able to publish about 15 gigs worth of password data, donation records, and actually source code that was out there. I read one article that said that Patreon, for some reason, they actually had the debugger, the code debugger installed on the production machine. I read that in SQL Server Magazine. How did that happen? You know, how would you get a debugger installed on a production box? So there's got to have been some things going wrong there in order for that to be able to happen. So that's actually a funding website. So it's kind of interesting when you look at these data breaches. You know, Target, you might think, yeah, that makes sense because they were able to get credit cards. Why would they hack into Patreon? You know, to be able to get donation records. That's what has a lot of people scratching their heads. So, you know, your company, you may think, oh, well, we're not really, you know, going to be have a problem with that because our company does this, and why would people, want to hack into that? Well, who knows? Why did someone want to hack into Portraying to be able to get into a crowdfunding application out there, subscription service for people to donate? So some of this stuff, it just kind of doesn't make sense all the time. So if you take a look at the costs associated with these data breaches, the average cost is about $277 in the U.S., but it's a little misleading because the cost is per record, and the average number of records lost is 2,300. So do the math there, in terms of how much each of these data breaches is costing. Obviously is something that we want to watch out for. And the other thing is, you can't really measure what the cost is associated with my personal information getting stolen or with my confidence in that company being lost. You just have to, there's some things that you can't put a monetary value on, and you obviously know that your company, you don't want your company to be one of those companies that people lose confidence that the data that they're giving you is going to be compromised or is not going to be secure. Okay, now in terms of what do these data breaches have in common, and I'd love for people to put in the chat, things that you've noticed, just a couple of things that I pulled out of these 3 different disparate data breaches. Number 1, access to usernames and passwords. And the fact that the usernames and passwords were not necessarily secure passwords, they were weak passwords. 1, 2, 3, 4, that is not a strong password, right? And people get frustrated because they're like, well, I have to remember all these passwords for all these different applications, and they end up either using a simple password or they use the same password for everything. So I think that's why Microsoft and some other companies are looking into, passwords is really not necessarily the best option for us out there. So, and then the ability not only to have a non-secure password, but also to be able to see that people are giving other people their password. That is a training issue, right? You've got to let your employees know you do not go out there and give your username and password to other people. I don't care if it's a sysadmin, you don't do that. The other thing that I thought was interesting, again, because I get this question all the time, is data stored in the cloud secure? Well, we work for a bank. We don't want to store our data in the cloud. Oh, we work for healthcare. We don't, you hear SharePoint supports HIPAA requirements out there in the cloud. So the fact that all this data was, a lot of it was stored in-house. This is not necessarily cloud data that got hacked. I think that's something interesting that I want to point out, because I think the cloud gets a bad rap for not being secure, but you have to look at, a lot of these data breaches, the data was actually stored in-house. It was stored on premises. Kathy, anything else that people have said in terms of the common data breaches?
Yeah, actually, we did have a question. You might want to address it later when we're talking about actual courses, but the question was,
okay.
Where do they learn more in depth about network segmentation to fill a knowledge gap?
Okay, so that would be in what, I'll cover that in more of our networking classes, and we can also forward that information, whoever asked that question, we can get with one of our network instructors and talk about specifically which classes would cover that.
And then we had another question. What do you recommend somebody does or a team does if their seniority, the senior management, is not supportive of spending money, the money that it takes to secure the data?
Well, that's a very common issue, unfortunately, and I'll give you an example. I worked for a hospital once, and we had a situation where they didn't want to spend the money on disaster recovery until, guess what happened? There was a disaster. You think about company like when the hurricane hit in New York City. A lot of companies, actually, there were several hospitals in New York City, they actually had their generators in the basement. Okay, so you have security people that come in, or excuse me, like in terms of disaster recovery, people don't want to spend money until there is a disaster, and then it's already too late, right? So the same thing is going to be true here in terms of these data breaches. It's, you have to look at the monetary cost of what would happen if that were to happen. So for example, if you think about $250 per record, and also think about customer confidence in your organization, that you're going to lose that. And it is one of those situations where you will have people that don't want to spend the money on it, but you have to look at the flip side and say, okay, well, if the data breach is going to happen, oh my gosh, why didn't we do something in the future? And that's been my experience, is you've got to get those people that are at the highest level, you've got to get them on board. You keep bringing it up, and the other thing is you document. You document, document, document. I always joke in that 3 rules for good application. It's true for security. It's true for anything. Documentation, documentation, documentation. You've got to get it out there that you've said multiple times, I'm concerned about our network, I'm concerned about our data. And take it upon yourself. Put a governance plan together. We're going to talk about that in just a second, to be able to say, I know this is important, I can see where it is, and keep hammering it home. And you can keep pointing out case studies. You can keep showing what has happened to these companies that have had data breaches and have lost customer confidence. So that's a great question, and it is I would say a non-trivial problem to solve if you do have higher-ups that don't want to support that, but it's so important. Any other correlations people see? Okay. Go ahead.
The same thing I'm reading here is that everybody says the number 1 correlation is human beings.
Human beings, that's exactly right. Okay, so, and I think this is shocking. I know when I tell people about this, everybody is shocked the fact that weak passwords and negligent employees. Those are really the top issues. So take a look at this statistic. Around 76% of network intrusions are due to weak passwords. Okay. Also, you do have to be careful about people if you're going to be using Android devices or any kind of phones, because there was an iPhone hack recently as well, especially over in China, that happened. But a lot of these things that you're downloading, like apps that you're downloading to your phone, are not governed. There's not a lot of governance. There's not a lot of rules in place. Those can actually be Trojan horses that could possibly get into your network. So really have to watch out for those kinds of things. Verizon did a big study on data breaches and found out that 80% of data breaches would have been stopped or forced to change tactics if there was something else besides using passwords. And I know Microsoft and some other companies are using things like managed accounts. Let's embrace that. Let's get away from this, password thing, because we've talked about some of the issues that are out there. But training your users that they have to, I know we all get annoyed, right? Oh, I have to change my password again. Oh, I can't remember what it is. But, you can't write it down. You have to have a strong password. Those are things that help with that defense in depth. And then negligent employees. You think about thorough background checking employees, training your employees, letting them know you cannot go around and give your username and password to anyone. Also, the fact that you might have distracted employees that don't even realize how much how much access to documents they have, and about 35% of data breaches happen because these distracted employees are giving out sensitive documents. Maybe they're emailing document out there. Maybe they've given their username and password to somebody they didn't realize. Oh my gosh, look at all those 25 people. By the way, those 25 or 27 people, whatever it is, at the NSA, they lost their jobs because they, they did figure out that they had given their username and password to Edward Snowden. So again, no matter which side of the fence you fall on there, I don't want y'all to lose your jobs. I want you to be able to keep your jobs. So it really is human beings is what this comes down to. So just a few things that I want to talk about, and I've got a URL that's got really good information on how to protect your data as well. You've got to know your data. I always say this in my classes, you have to know what the data is, you have to register your assets, you have to know what it is that you're talking about with your data, and then you have to assess from a risk assessment standpoint. Think about if Target, or think about if, I know these are humongous organizations and it can be a challenge. It's definitely a non-trivial problem to solve, but you have to look at your risk and say, okay, what data, if it was to get compromised, what can we do to protect that data? Staff security awareness, making sure that the staff understands the security that's out there, making sure that if you don't know how to segment your network, come take a class, come read some articles there on making sure that if you have vendor applications coming in, that you're not compromising that network out there. And then you've got to have governance. Governance is so important. I've been to so many companies where they're like, we don't really know what data we have. We don't really know exactly who's responsible for it. We want to point fingers at everyone else. We joke about data stewards. A lot of time in class, data steward is the person that takes ownership of the data. A lot of times nobody wants to be the data steward because it does require extra, it's a lot of more work, you know, and they're like, well, I'm not even getting paid to do this. But it's one of those things where you want to take ownership of that data so that you know what the data is, you know what data you have out there and what could be compromised. What's your incident reporting? What's your management regarding incidents? So, you know, what's the auditing that's going on? What happens if you see that, hey, somebody accessed the data? And actually that's what happened at Target. It was about a couple of, I think it was a few days later, that one of the sysadmins saw a scripted run that he didn't run. That's when that started kicking into place, you know, hey, something's going on here. Also, secure system configuration, making sure that you've got antivirus software out there, that you're updating your patches, okay? Updating patches, antivirus software, those are two big things that you know you should do, but is it being done? And are you documenting the fact that you're doing all of this? And then also securing your network, you know, making sure that you've got multiple firewalls in place to be able to make sure that your, you know, domain controllers and things like that, that there's, again, that defense in depth that has to go on. Also monitoring. Making sure that you're monitoring the network, looking for you know, issues with the data. Who's accessing your data? What access controls do you have in place for, you know, again, you don't want everybody to be able to be sysadmin on the machines. You want to be able to only give them the permissions that they need. What malware do you have in place? You need to go back right now, right, and make sure that you have malware that's not just the little free version of Malwarebytes that runs whatever you tell it to run, but that it is actually ongoing and protecting your applications out there. Make sure you have those patches that you're, if a patch comes out, you need to be applying that. I always tell people, in terms of patching, there is a bleeding edge, right? I mean, sometimes if you're the first person to apply the patch, it might be painful because it, you know, you have to look at the testing and read what other people are saying. But look out there, look and, you know, be aware on your patching policies. See what other people are saying about this. Also, things like hot fixes. Hot fixes are not regression tested. Service packs are regression tested. So, you know, sometimes if you apply a hot fix, it might fix one problem, but also might create other problems unless it's the actual issue that you're running into. So be very careful about those things. And then also encryption. You don't want to be that person at Anthem that said, well, encryption was just, you know, inconvenient for us. Again, HIPAA says encryption is required, and actually, if you're not encrypting your data, especially sensitive data out there, that could actually point to weak security systems in place, and that could be something that hackers, you know, could go after. So take a look at that website, peak10.com, and that'll be included in the slides that you'll get tomorrow, but some tips out there for securing your enterprise data. Again, this is not rocket science in terms of, you've probably heard all these things before, but it really is just so important to make sure that you're patching, that you have your malware in place, and number one, that you are training your employees, that you're doing background checks, and that you have secure passwords that people are using. You don't want to, you know, be using that same username and password for 10 different accounts, and you've got to train your employees and let them know that it is not okay to give that username and password out to other people. Okay. All right, so that concludes my presentation. Are there any other questions that anybody had?
Yeah, so everybody, we have 5 minutes. We want to be good stewards of your time. We will take questions. I know I already have 2. So this is
okay.
a chance to put your questions in. But while we're kind of waiting for extra questions, I want everybody to know before you start logging off, because we have a special promotion for those who are attending this webinar, not somebody who's just listening to it, the recording later on, but attending the webinar. We're offering you 20% off of any of the classes that are on our slide deck here. We've got SQL Server courses for you. We also have security courses for your certification courses in security. All of these are coming up within the next, before the end of the year. So we also, in conjunction with that, have a buy two, get one free program that is running. And you will receive all this information in that email that we'll send to you tomorrow with a link to the details about the buy two, get one free. But basically that states that if you buy two classes and sit them between now and December at regular price, then you can get a third of equal or lesser value, and you can sit that class as late as March 31st of 2016. So that means that you could, as one person, have 3 classes for the price of 2, or if you're a company and you've got a team that all needs to take the same class, you could send 3 people to a class and only pay for 2. So anyway, like I said, we'll have the link for you. If you move on to the next slide, Shelley, I want to share with you some of the SQL Server courses that we've got. Specifically related to this webinar, that administering Microsoft SQL Server databases on November 2nd and the designing a data solution. Both of those have a security aspect to them for SQL administrators. I know that Shelley can talk a little bit more. I think she teaches both of those. I don't know if she's teaching both on those dates. But then we have the related courses as well. Do you have something to add very quickly about those, Shelley?
Yes, specifically the designing a data solution with SQL Server. That class, we do talk a lot about cloud services, so we get into SQL Azure or SQL Database as it's called now. We get into Windows Azure, connecting your backing up to the cloud, and a lot of people have concerns about security. And again, it goes back to what we talked about in class. It's not so much that the cloud is the issue, it's that all of these other things that we talked about are the issues. So if you're interested in at all looking at cloud services or anything data related to the cloud, the designing a data solution class is really good. And then the administering SQL Server databases, those of you that want to learn how to do SQL Server administration, including setting up security, making sure your database is secure, that's a great class for DBAs.
Thank you. So the next slide, this one is going to show you all the courses that we have that are certification courses for those in security specifically. Max actually has Mile 2. Mile 2 has written this courseware. The courseware has been approved by the NSA and the CNSS. And so you can see we've got penetration testing engineer, information systems risk manager, information systems security officer, disaster recovery engineer, penetration testing consultant, and digital forensics examiner. All of these courses are available in that buy two get one. So if your security people at your team are not on this webinar, they will not get the 20% off, but we do still have that buy two get one free. So that might be, you might want to share that with your team. So the 2 questions that I have so far are, one of them is, how do alternative authentication types like retinal scans, fingerprint readers, etc., how do those hold up against traditional passwords? And is a combination solution, the kind of thinking here, is that better than just using one technology?
That's a great question. So I've been reading some, first of all, those technologies I would say are in the beginning stages, so I think we'll see those more and more and more as we go along. I was actually talking to someone recently about fingerprint. So like my iPhone 6 uses fingerprint where I can get onto my phone without typing in my code, and those are secure, and it is much harder to replicate those, but the cost associated with them a lot of times is prohibitive to companies. So I think as we go along that we will see more of those types of security coming into place because it is harder to replicate. It's just that the cost at this time can be prohibitive. But I'm interested to see in the future, and the future could be 6 months from now, right? It could be, the technology changes so quickly. I think we'll start to see more and more and more of that because as we saw, passwords just really are not the secure, it's just not, they're not working in terms of security. So that's a great question. What was the other one?
It wasn't necessarily so much a question as just a comment about recalling the OneCloud hack. It was a brute force attack into iCloud, if you recall, and got all those, I think it was Jennifer Lawrence, in fact, her pictures off of their iPhones. So if you had any comments about that.
Well, I'm trying to think if I remember that happening. I don't know exactly what happened in that particular hack, but my gut feeling on that is probably not the cloud was the issue. It was probably, I would say it would probably go back to human beings in some way would have probably been involved, because what happens when your data actually gets moved to the cloud, it gets replicated 3 times, which does kind of put bells and whistles out there for people, or sirens, I should say. But the other thing is the data actually gets encrypted when it gets replicated. So if someone were to just hack into the cloud, like to the cloud database per se, you know, they're not going to be able to see the data. It's going to be, they're going to have some kind of authentication to be able to get up there and get that information. So I would be interested in looking into that, because I don't really know a whole lot about that one. But from all the ones that I've read, they almost all of them have some kind of a human element to them. And I think it'll, you know, some of these are still coming out and they're not necessarily wanting to tell us exactly what happened either.
Right.
So.
Well, thank you. We are now at 1:01. We've gone 1 minute over. I know everybody has to get back. We thank you very much. If you are interested right away in taking advantage of any of those promotional offers, remember, you can call us. In fact, that's probably the best way. Just call us at 513-322-8888, or if you're long distance and not on a mobile phone, it's 866-595-6863. Thank you, Shelley, and thank you, attendees.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.